In a world consumed by endless conflict, from global crisis and regional wars to personal struggles, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Why is the world in such a mess right now? And could there be an underlying cause that we might have overlooked? According to Carl Jung, the answer lies within ourselves. In his book, The Undiscovered Self, Jung suggests that the root of many societal issues stems from people who haven't fully discovered who they are and therefore remain a mystery to themselves. Jung wrote The Undiscovered Self in 1957, during the Cold War, a period of intense global tension. He argued that the psychological conflicts people face often mirror the broader societal conflicts. In his eyes, many of these problems arose because people were disconnected from their true selves, trapped in what he called collective identity. In Jung's view, collective identity is what happens when people lose their individuality, absorbing the beliefs and behaviors of the masses without questioning them. This herd thinking makes us more susceptible to manipulation, especially by authoritarian regimes. When we're disconnected from our true selves, we stop thinking critically and we can easily support harmful movements or policies. Jung's warnings about collective identity and herd thinking feel just as relevant today as they did in 1957. Recording this in October 2024, it would be enough for me to just read the top news headlines. From rising authoritarianism to mass protests, it's clear that people are swept up in ideological battles that they may not fully understand. Jung would argue that this happens because many of us are still disconnected from our true selves, making us vulnerable to manipulation by populist rhetoric and political extremes. And it's not just about politics. Mental health crises are skyrocketing worldwide, and Jung would likely see this as a symptom of disconnection from our inner selves. Jung's solution to this remains the same. We must rediscover our inner values. By breaking free from the collective identity, we can finally regain control of our own decisions, whether that's resisting harmful political movements by voting or protests, or taking responsibility for our mental health, or making conscious decisions to protect the environment. We see polarization everywhere: politics, social media, even our communities. Society is divided into increasingly extreme camps, each side convinced that they are right and the other is the enemy. Jung would say that this happens when people project their own unresolved inner conflicts onto the outside world. Polarization, in Jung's view, is a collective reflection of personal fragmentation. So when we don't confront the darker, less acceptable parts of ourselves, what Jung would call the shadow, then we project those parts onto others. So instead of owning up to our own flaws or contradictions, we label the other as the enemy, demonizing them instead of dealing with our own inner conflicts. The more disconnected we are from our true selves, the easier it becomes to fall into this trap. People stuck in this state of inner conflict become more vulnerable to black and white thinking and tribalism, which is exactly what fuels polarization. And this is where authoritarianism thrives. Jung believed that when individuals lack personal individuation, that is, when they haven't fully developed their own sense of self and they are stuck in this constant state of inner conflict, they become easy targets for authoritarian figures. And I would also extend that to populist figures. So people who are disconnected from their own beliefs and values are just more likely to be drawn to strong, charismatic leaders who promise them certainty and order. Authoritarians capitalize on this need for external authority, exploiting people's fear and uncertainty. Jung warned that without individuation, people will willingly surrender their freedoms, seeking safety in the collective identity offered by these leaders. This allows dangerous regimes to rise because people aren't thinking critically or independently. They are following the herd, just like Jung predicted. Jung's ideas about the dangers of collective identity and mass-mindedness play out vividly in today's political and social landscape. His theories aren't just abstract, they are alive, actively shaping the world we see around us. Consider the extreme polarization gripping countries around the globe. In the United States, the recent presidential campaign with Kamala Harris facing off against Donald Trump underscored a deeply divided nation. Polls show that fewer and fewer Americans believe the opposing party shares their values and goals. According to the latest surveys, over 80% of Americans think that democracy is under threat, with a lot of them saying they feel isolated from those who hold different political views. In France, the recent election exposed the same rift, with leftists, centrists, and populists clashing over national identity and immigration. Similarly, in Mexico, the latest election was marked by violence and intense polarization, with one of the bloodiest campaigns on record. Over 30 candidates were murdered, leading to the vote. Where polarization takes root, authoritarianism often follows. Leaders like Russia's Vladimir Putin, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Netanyahu in Israel, and more recently the leaders of the ruling political party in Georgia, the list goes on. They have all seized on these vulnerabilities. Jung would argue that individuals who lack self-awareness are particularly susceptible to these leaders' promises of certainty and control, as they look outside themselves for answers and a sense of order. This reliance on external authority makes herd thinking almost inevitable. In Israel, for example, many continue to support Netanyahu's policies, even as they lead to war crimes and full-blown wars. In Germany, the far-right AfD party has gained ground by harnessing social media to sway voters, while France's National Rally has used digital platforms and AI to stir up nationalism and anti-immigration sentiment. Jung might see these movements as symptoms of a deeper psychological fragmentation, a society looking outward, surrendering individual moral responsibility to collective ideologies that feel easier to embrace. And this collective denial is not limited to strictly politics. We see it clearly in the climate crisis. Despite overwhelming evidence of climate change, many remain indifferent or resistant to urgent action. According to a recent UN report, global emissions need to be cut by 45% by 2030 to avoid catastrophic warming. Yet, a significant amount of countries, or the majority of them, influenced by powerful corporate interests, are falling short. For Jung, this could be seen as society projecting its unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths, refusing to face our collective impact on the planet. And this denial is amplified by a culture of consumerism. Corporations bombard us with messages to consume more, subtly suggesting that material goods can satisfy our deepest needs. But Jung would argue that this consumer culture only fuels further inner dissatisfaction, perpetuating herd behavior by distracting individuals from true self-awareness and meaningful change. Consumption becomes a substitute for self-fulfillment, a profitable cycle for companies, but a destructive one for individuals and the environment. Jung's insights urge us to reflect. Are we truly acting from personal conviction, or are we following the crowd? Are we living by our own values or by values imposed upon us? In a world dominated by division and mass manipulation, self-awareness becomes a radical act of resistance, a way to reclaim our minds from the collective pressures that stifle both individual and societal growth. This process of individuation is slow but transformative. The more we know ourselves, the less susceptible we are to external pressures and manipulation. Small actions like self-reflection and empathy can ripple outward, helping to counteract polarization and promote healing in our communities. When we understand ourselves better, we become more thoughtful, critical, and compassionate members of society. So whether it's journaling, meditation, therapy, or intentional solitude without any distractions, I think we should all start this journey of deeper inner healing and encourage people around us to do as well by our own examples.